the pushback of nature within 5 or 6 years is absolutely astonishing. We're having it in the Great Lakes right here. Species that people thought were extinct suddenly come back. And that pushback, I think, since we're part of nature too, applies to culture, applies to the kind of societies. We will hang on, we will improvise, we'll get through somehow, but it'll be a rough ride.
Ian, welcome to Bookends. Thank you so much for coming in.
Well, it's very nice to be here.
Your fiction has often dealt with the past and the concept of what we can know about people who came before us. But your new novel is set 100 years in the future with characters that are looking back to their past, which is actually close to our present. Why did you want to engage this setup for your story?
Well, I love reading novels that give me back a sense of where we are now and what we're up to and what difficulties we face, as well as pleasures. And I thought that maybe one of the best ways of coming at this would be what the future thinks of us. They might look back on us with extreme resentment that we didn't get on top of climate change. But in this case, my narrator, who's a scholar, who's very interested in a contemporary poet, a completely fictional poet, has a great ambivalence. Of course, he knows all about the problems we face, but he also envies us, our existing forests, our incredibly energetic literature, a golden telescope 1,000,000 miles out in space, and then all the crazy things that in the rather conventional world that he lives in, there's no time for, no technology for, except the internet still exists. So he's looking back on, 3 or 4 billion people watching the same soccer game or cheese rolling competitions, gay pride marches, street parties, rock and roll, massive symphony orchestras. And I suppose in part I wanted to bring attention to all the usual problems, but also running alongside that, we have great treasures. We do not want to lose them.
Mm-hmm. Things that we might take for granted, it sounds like.
Yeah.
The ability to, as you say, have a couple billion people watching something like the FIFA World Cup we don't think of as remarkable all the time. Why 100 years in the future as your sort of vantage point to look back at our current times?
In my earlier drafts, I had it as 400 years. And then in discussion with friends, I began to realize that I wanted a future that was still kind of heavily related to our present. Just as if we look back on the 20th century, back to 1925, that interwar period. So, and I realized too, 400 years, the language would have changed. Everything would be so dramatically different. And part of a larger project I have, we live between the ghosts of the dead and the unborn ghosts of the future. We ourselves are so self-evidently real to ourselves that we keep it at the back of our minds that soon we will be the ghosts and someone else, other people who we'll never meet, will be looking back on us. And yet it's written from the point of view of a scholar who is deeply invested in knowing what he can know about us and particularly about this poet.
You've mentioned that there's been some ecological catastrophe. This is a world that's living with the aftermath of very significant global conflict. Can you set the scene for me a little bit about what it's like in the year 2119 in your novel?
Well, a thermonuclear bomb on its way to the southern United States has dropped by accident into the mid-Atlantic and sent out colossal tsunamis to the west coast of Africa, Western Europe, and the eastern seaboard of North America. And many, many cities are now underwater. In England, where a great deal of this takes place, inland lakes have formed. So Britain is now an archipelago, a set of islands. All the big institutions, the museums, the knowledge bases, the libraries and so on have migrated to high ground. Industrial civilization has more or less faded, but there's an element of it around. As I say, the internet's still working. And England has become a very quiet backwater, and it's very, very conventional. Nobody likes to disagree about anything. They're very oppressed by a violent past, violent recent past. And my man wants to break out, and he's almost in love with one of the characters, the poet's wife. It's almost like a piece of marital affair over 100 years. That's the only barrier, as it were, between them. So he gets heavily invested in this particular evening when the poet reads what he considers his finest poem. It's a long sequence of sonnets. He reads it to friends and family, and at the end of that reading, he hands over the only copy, rolled up on vellum in fair copy of his best writing, and gives it to his wife, Vivian Blundy. And the future simply does not know what happened to that poem. But future generations over the years fantasize about it, they talk about it. It's a blank page on which they've projected their desires, their fears, etc. So in many ways, it's a quest. This novel is a quest, a search for this poem, as well as a search for those boundaries that stop us knowing everything about someone else. So hence the title.
Mm-hmm. It's a world that exists kind of in an in-between space. It's not quite this dystopian fiction of the future that you sometimes see where there's a complete obliteration of anything resembling modern technology. This is a world that still has the internet, that still has some capacity for scholars to work at universities and engage in research that's still concerned with poetry. There's a luxury of that. But this is also a world where travel has become very difficult, where some of, the computing power that we have now has been somewhat reduced, or people have less access to it than they do now in 2025. Why did you want to create this future world that combined all of those elements? Like, so many authors would choose to go either for a sort of techno-utopia or the sort of Dune-like technology-less future.
Well, I guess the answer to that would be I'm trying to pursue the truth, as it were. And what I do in speculating about the future is just draw a line from the past. I grew up in the 1950s as a child. Behind me were 90 million deaths. The first half of the 20th century was catastrophic. If you'd been an Edwardian lady in 1903, in rather peaceful times, and to be told that of the Holocaust, of the First World War, which just never really stopped, it was just a sort of pause before the Second World War began, she'd hardly believe it. So, look at Europe in 1945, rubble, millions of people displaced. And then 30 years later, Europe is, restoring itself at an extraordinary pace. So, excluding the possibility of an all-out civilizational wipeout, I think we will somehow scrape through. We will have these disasters, catastrophes, but there will be enough people to sort of push on with diminished lives, certainly. So I've run my pessimism and optimism along lines not only of the past, but I look at all the experiments that are happening around the world. If you want to be cheered up, you just have to spend some time reading about them. For example, huge areas of the ocean have banned fishing, especially that bottom scraping fishing that destroys everything. The pushback of nature within, as an area in Scotland shows, within 5 or 6 years is absolutely astonishing. We're having it in the Great Lakes right here. Species that people thought were extinct suddenly come back. And that pushback, I think, since we're part of nature too, applies to culture, applies to the kind of societies. We will hang on, we will improvise, we'll get through somehow, but it'll be a rough ride.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it won't be without its significant losses, I suppose.
Yeah.
I'm curious for you now, as someone who's lived through so much, has kind of the opportunity to be nostalgic perhaps for earlier parts of your life, or even perhaps, as your main character does in this novel, times from before you were born. Do you feel that you've been ever guilty at all of hearkening back to some imagined past and thinking like, man, wouldn't it have been better to be living my life at that point?
Sometimes, I mean, there's discussions like, which century would you like to live in?
Mm.
And I often say uh, the early or late 17th century, either during Shakespeare's time or during Newton's time. But I also think almost immediately I'd be living without anesthetics.
Mm-hmm.
I read a very close account of Samuel Pepys, the diarist. He had a bladder stone removed. I mean, it's just, he had to be held down by 4 guys and just a shot of brandy and then a rusty knife and filthy surgeon's hands. So we should never get into this sort of hazy, romantic notion that there's some golden age. We might be the golden age if things go really badly in the future.
Mm-hmm.
Our amazing access to foods and all the kind of luxuries of, here we are in Toronto, and I'm, last night had the most delicious olive oil poured over my salad, and it was, from Puglia in Italy. If those supply chains go, people will be nostalgic about us.
About the salad, yeah.
Yeah,
Again,
the salad.
These things we take for granted. The poem that's at the center of this story, it's quite complex, but we don't get to read it. We're getting these sort of fragmented impressions as the reader. That absence makes it perhaps more powerful than the poem actually could have been, right? It's that mythology, that quality that it has. I'm wondering for you, though, as the novelist, does the poem exist for you? Is there somewhere a draft of it that we, as readers of your novel, are never going to get to see?
Well, there are 2 things to say about that. In my early drafts, I quoted several lines of this poem that's meant to be so brilliant. And then I have a friend who regularly sees my novels after my wife, Annalena, has read them and made her marks. She was a newspaper editor for many years. Anyway, my second friend, he was very enthusiastic about the novel. So enthusiastic that I knew there was a but coming along. And that but was, and he's remarkably honest about these things, he said, look, you're not a good poet. And as soon as he said it, I knew he was right, that it's much better for us all not to have read it, including me. If I claim it's an extraordinary poet, and the poet himself thinks it's his finest work, let's leave it that way.
You have clearly such a deep love and appreciation for poets. What has your relationship with poetry been like, I guess, as a reader, but not a writer of poetry?
I mean, I started about the age of 16 when I came alive to literature. It was poetry that blew me away. I guess Wordsworth was one of the first, T.S. Eliot, Auden. I regard poetry as the finest literary expression that we have in its such condensed form, its rhythmic nature, which is so at one with the pulse of our being or even the heartbeats of our lives. It's also ancient. It has some connection to the distant past. I mean, we can read a poem that's 2,700 years old, the Odyssey. The novel, on the other hand, is a piece of recent froth compared to the poem, an invention in the English tradition, at least, of the 18th century. We might consider the novel as a higher form of gossip, really. We are very interested in each other. We've developed this form that is, I think, unique in its ability to get into other people's minds. I think that's why it hasn't really died when it's faced such eloquent opposition. I mean, I love long-form TV series, and sometimes it makes me think of very long Victorian novels. And the novel's very good at working out the relationship between people in their immediate surroundings, their families, their neighborhoods, and their societies at large. That we have not found a better instrument for. I still retain absolute faith in in poetry at its best as being our highest form.
I'm curious then, when you began writing, what made you turn to the novel as opposed to poetry? If you have this kind of great respect for poetry
Yeah.
as this highest form of literature.
I don't really know the answer to that question. I started at the age of 18 or 19. I guess I wanted to set down my own thoughts in prose fiction rather than struggle with the severe difficulty of being kind of apt and beautiful with poetry. And once you've had one or two stories published and you get some good responses, you tend to just sort of go down that avenue.
Could you have imagined back then at that time that you were getting those initial positive responses, had those first short stories published? Was there any world in which you foresaw that you would be able to make a career of being a novelist and a writer of stories?
Well, back in the early 70s, you could live on almost nothing. And that was a huge privilege. Also, no distraction from the internet. So that other great luxury of civilization, solitude, was all around you. And I'm often asked to give advice to young writers, and I say, get off the internet for 4 or 5 hours a day and discover your own mind. Just because it is so seductive, so powerful. It gets right into the kind of fine print of our daily lives, reaching for that powerful little squat little thing in your pocket. So that was the fact that you could live on so little and rents were low, which I think has had a huge effect on literature. It was possible. I lived in not so far from central London. The rent was maybe about $40 a month. So if I wrote a piece for a magazine and it was paid £150, that took care of the rent for quite a while and gave me all the freedom I needed. Those conditions have gone. If you're living near a city, in a city, it's tough. I think if a government wanted to subsidize writing, they should think of rent subsidy. Rent subsidy for novelists and poets. Of course, everyone will be declaring themselves novelists and poets, I know, but they'd have to deal with that somehow.
Ian, what we can know, like a number of your previous novels, uses these written documents and kind of archives, journals and emails to reveal new information about the past to the reader and also sometimes to characters in the novel as well. Yet there's all this textual evidence and truth and true knowledge is somewhat elusive to many of your characters. Why does this idea of the sort of slipperiness of truth, even when we have documentary evidence of certain things, interest you?
Well, I posit in this novel that my scholar would have access to the internet, that it has not been disrupted. The difference, say, between being a biographer looking back to the 19th or 18th centuries, we have their letters, and we have the letters of their friends. Letters, especially before the penny posts were established, tended to be longer, more subjective, more considered, 3,000 or 4,000 words, because of that slowness of delivery and return. My scholar is facing an utter avalanche of information. Every last email, text that the poet Francis Blundy sent in a lifetime is his to read. How much information do they really contain? Most of us don't write long emails, or certainly don't write long texts. We might know far more about Tolstoy or Darwin or Napoleon's life. They were all great letter writers. It's a different kind of knowledge, but it's distinctly separate. So coming at the truth is very difficult, I think, if you're just looking at texts and emails. The pursuit of the truth, which is always the central point of life, I guess. One of the characters is slowly, but too slowly, dying of Alzheimer's. Many of us have experience of, my mother died of it, close friends have it, my son, a scientist, researches on it. And its crucial feature is the slow loss of memory. As that memory goes, then identity goes with it. And there is a relationship between the loss of memory in an individual and the loss of memory in a society. And that loss of memory that matter is called history. A society that's lost touch with its history is losing its identity, is one of the concerns of this novel. It shocked me when history as a subject began to be downgraded in our schools. And I think, looking at the world now, a whole generation of men and women who were either active in the war, affected by it, or who grew up in its shadow, are almost all gone. And many of the institutions that followed when people thought we must never go there again, and the UN is one of them, I think are being slowly undermined, specifically, I think, by the United States, but others have used it purely not to make peace, but to further their own aims. And that's, I think, because there's a loss of memory. And that obviously connects to your question about the pursuit of truth. But a historical sense, a historical imagination is crucial, I think, to getting a grip on the truth in your own societies at this time. And now, of course, we're overwhelmed by the software that allows people to multiply tweet, etc. And we're besieged, by conspiracy theories, hateful email, hateful texts, and so on. So I think a sense of communally recognized trust in legacy media and so on have all become a real problem for us, a real problem. And as my scholar says at one point, it's as if credulous medieval masses have charged onto the wrong theatre stage, the theatre stage of modernity, and taken it over. Because even as science blossoms in our time, we're in a golden age of discovery about cosmos and biochemistry and so on. Conspiracy theories are swelling. Moves against experts and science are swelling and so on. We're a very contradictory age. You can love us or hate us. And the future, in the mind of my scholar, is he does both.
That was such a wide-ranging answer, and I want to thank you for it, because I feel sometimes that we're living through an era of unprecedented change, or change that is moving at a rate that's too fast for me to totally apprehend or understand. And you're kind of describing feeling perhaps a bit yourself that way, and feeling like that's what happens to the world in which this novel takes place, that there's this rapid change that people can't kind of stop or understand as it's going on, whether it's with climate, whether it's with the escalation of war. I guess, is that how you feel about sort of the way our world is moving currently?
I mean, moving too fast, yes, but I have a larger worry. It's almost, I could even describe it as being larger than climate change. I hear it from all quarters, not just culture critics or intellectuals or writers, ordinary people saying, I don't think my children or grandchildren will have as good a life as I had. And it's as if we stood before a giant doorway in which we lose faith in the future. I call it metaphysical gloom. And when you lose faith in the future, or any sense of positivity about the future, you also then abandon all hopes of human progress. And once you've given up on that, then it's a self-fulfilling matter. Things will be worse for your grandchildren if we lose that spirit that we can make things better. And I think it hangs in the balance for us at the moment. We're not quite there yet, but I hear it so often from people.
There is almost an abdication of responsibility, perhaps, that comes with saying, well, my children are just not going to have as good a life as I've had.
Well,
And that's it.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And the first thing I think we should ask ourselves is, what are our moral duties to the future? And I mean, obviously, climate change, biodiversity are crucial in this fact, or the quality of soil. The subjects are enormous. Things are going on. People are thinking about these things. We are moving, and there was a long optimistic piece in the New Yorker by Bill McEwan, a prophet of doom of climate change, saying the energy transition is happening. We just don't notice it because it's happening in China, not here. If I were wanting to talk to Christian evangelists in the southern United States who seem not to care about climate change, most of them at least, I would say God has made a world in which the earth is bathed every day with trillions and trillions of photons. And he's made the law of physics such that it's very easy to transform a photon into an electron. And we're showered in this. It's a gift from the laws of nature, which were discovered by Albert Einstein. That's how he got his Nobel Prize, the photoelectric effect. And some of the poorest countries in the world are the countries that are photon rich. They're the hottest countries in the world. That they should have virtually free energy is just a shot away, as Mick Jagger used to sing.
Another kind of very alive issue that you explore somewhat in What We Can Know is this issue of artificial intelligence and the way that that plays out over the 100 years between our present and the present or our future, as explored in this novel in 2119. You imagine a world in which artificial intelligence, at least in the UK, is overseen by this federal body and it's very strictly regulated. Students can only access it on a very specific desktop computer and only once every couple of days. Very different, obviously, to the way that AI exists here in 2025. What was your thinking behind articulating that vision of a future for artificial intelligence?
This was my one bit of utopian thinking, really, because I think leaving AI in the hands of profit-seeking, shareholder-aware big tech companies is incredibly dangerous. We've already seen it with the internet itself and social media, run very, very cynically, mostly by big tech companies who just want to get children and adults hooked in, clickbait everywhere. And their duty is to their shareholders, not to human well-being. So I guess I should say also, in the 1990s, when all this started happening, the internet, many of us, myself included, thought it was one of the greatest liberations of mankind ever. Citizen journalism, resistance groups in oppressive societies, all that would come to pass. Amazing benign connections between peoples across different races and nations and so on. And it went sour. I think it went sour about 2015 when the software was written that allowed people to retweet, as it were. Personally, I've now reached the point where I think anyone who wishes to put anything across on the internet should be fully identifiable. No more secrecy, no more hiding behind anonymity to say things that you would never dare say to someone's face. It has to be stopped. You can't be for a woman. It's very difficult now for a woman to be in public life, let alone be an MP, without getting just torrents of the vilest underside of human nature. I thought, well, I've imagined nuclear wars, I've imagined lots of disasters, but in sleepy old England, and I don't mention whether it's happened in the rest of the world, you cannot blog without your address and your passport, and the oppression of money-seeking tech companies has ended. But what's happening in Mexico or Afghanistan, like,
Yeah, in the world of your novel, that's left to the imagination.
all novels have to be local.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and if I covered all 200 countries, you would have I don't think that bookcase would even bear the weight.
It's more of a CIA world fact book, perhaps, about the imagined future at that point.
It'd be 1 trillion pages.
Mm-hmm. Your new novel, What We Can Know, it's so much about legacy, what is left behind, kind of imagining a bit what we might be leaving behind as people of the early 21st century for our descendants to look back on, investigate, imagine about. You've been writing for 50 years. If we just look at your published work, it's an incredible body of work. How do you think about legacy in relation to your own life and your own body of work? Is that something that does come up for you at all?
It doesn't really. I'm not going to be around. So, I mean, my sense of death, by the way, is, I think, even as a child, I thought this. It's going to be much like before I was born. In other words, less than nothing, not even nothing. Legacy. Well, of course, I would like to be read. I notice among my friends and many other writers that dying is not a good career move. There's a blast of obituaries and reminiscences and memorials a year later, and then often a kind of dip that the names start going, or society just shifts a bit, and they either become very censorious. So the reputations of, in the States, Philip Roth, John Updike, Saul Bellow, Norman Mailer, of, in the atmosphere of Me Too, their reputations have really bottomed to where they were, when they were at their peak in their 50s and 60s. So you never know what's going to happen. Suddenly your work's going to look very different. So the ground could shift. And that can't be predicted. So my work might be considered utterly repellent by future generations, or it might be just, like the word of God. Who knows? Who knows? That can't be controlled.
On that note, I mean, this is a novel that raises some distressing questions about how our generation, how our time is going to be looked back on. Also feels somewhat hopeful to me, I suppose.
Yeah.
I guess, is that a hope that you feel about 2119 when you think about what that year is going to be like?
Well, if we could send a message back to 1925, could we say, oh, listen, don't worry, it's all fine? But nor would we say it's a total mess.
Mm-hmm.
Tokyo, Dresden, London, Prague, Berlin, all got rebuilt. Mm-hmm. And they're now bustling towns with people who are going about their business, not thinking about 1945. So it will always be, and that's, as I said earlier, excluding a total nuclear wipeout of civilization, it will always be a bit of both. We will have catastrophes along the way, and we will get by.
Mm. Ian, this conversation has given me so much to think about. The novel gave me so much to think about. I want to thank you for your time and thank you so much for this work and for coming in and chatting with me today.
Well, it's been a great pleasure, and thank you for such lovely questions.